Charles Oakley once told a locker room full of reporters that power forwards who weighed 260 pounds didn't lose sleep over 6'6" shooting guards, and 3 hours later he was still awake, replaying a single possession in the dark. It was February 14th, 1993. Valentine's Day, Madison Square Garden, 7th Avenue and 33rd Street, the most famous basketball arena on the planet, a building that had been hosting the collision of ambition and talent since 1968, and that wore its history the way old fighters wear scars visibly, without apology. The tip-off was 7:30 in the evening, and the court had the particular shine of a floor that had been cleaned too recently, the overhead lights catching it in long yellow bands that made the painted lane look deeper than it was. The Garden was sold out. It was always sold out when Jordan came to town. The New York Knicks were 29-19 at that point in the season, pressing hard for the second seed in the Eastern Conference and carrying with every home game the particular pressure of a franchise that had last won a championship in 1973 and felt the distance of those 20 years, in the specific way a proud organization feels the passage of time without a title, not as grief exactly, but as a weight that redistributes itself through everything you do. Pat Riley was coaching them, standing at the sideline in his impeccable suit, with the posture of a man who had won 4 championships in Los Angeles and brought his entire vocabulary of expectation to Manhattan, where expectation was already the native language. The Knicks were built around physicality and defensive pressure, and the individual willingness of every player on the floor to make the game cost something for whoever was on the other side. Charles Oakley was the living embodiment of that philosophy. He averaged 12 points and 11 rebounds that season, but the statistics missed the point of him entirely, the way statistics often miss the point of players whose true contribution is atmospheric rather than numerical. Oakley's real output was something you felt in the first quarter of a game against him, in the specific awareness that every entry into the paint would be answered with a body, that every loose ball would involve a forearm, that the game would be played on terms he intended to set and maintain, regardless of what the other side preferred. He was 6 feet 9 inches and 245 pounds of professional consequence, a man who had been Jordan's teammate in Chicago before being traded to New York in 1988, who knew Jordan's game with the intimate precision of someone who had practiced against it daily for 2 years, and who had, in the intervening 5 seasons, developed opinions about it. His opinion, formed across those 5 seasons and expressed in varying forms to the New York press with the casual authority of a man who believed it completely, was that Jordan was a guard, and guards who drove into the paint against his teams did so at an educational cost. He was not contemptuous of Jordan. He was, if anything, the opposite, a former teammate who understood the scope of Jordan's talent and believed, because of that understanding, that he also understood its boundaries. He thought he knew where Jordan stopped. This was the mistake. Jordan had watched the pregame from the visiting locker room with the focused inward attention he brought to every environment that required something from him, which was every environment he ever entered professionally. He had taped his wrists already, pulling the white athletic tape with the slow, deliberate tension that his current teammates on the Bulls had learned to interpret as a calibration, a private ritual that was less about physical preparation than about the construction of a particular internal state, the closing of a door behind which everything that was not competition was placed and locked away. Scottie Pippen, getting ready 3 lockers down, glanced at him once and then looked away. He knew the signs. When Jordan taped slowly, the evening had already been decided in rooms the opponent could not access. He had heard about Oakley's comments. Of course he had. He had heard them through the elaborate peripheral intelligence he maintained throughout every season, the awareness of what was being said about him in every city the Bulls visited, not because he sought it out, but because some part of him was perpetually monitoring the frequencies on which disrespect was broadcast. His former teammates in Chicago would describe, with the rueful affection of men who had survived proximity to something large, the specific quality of Jordan's silence when provocation had reached him. It was not performative silence. It was the silence of a man who had received information and filed it in the correct location, who had taken a perceived slight and placed it precisely in the load-bearing structure of his competitive identity, where it would harden and generate pressure and eventually express itself on a court in front of thousands of people. who would not know, watching, that the play they were witnessing had its origin in a casual remark made days earlier in a different city. Jordan never responded to words with words. He responded to words with basketball, which was so much more expensive. The first quarter of the game developed in the manner of a physical negotiation between two teams that had spent years learning each other's vocabulary. The Knicks pushed the pace of contact to its legal limit and occasionally passed it, the referees managing the margins with the pragmatic tolerance of officials who understood that some games had an atmospheric pressure that pure rule enforcement could not adequately contain. Jordan played through it. He scored 9 points in the first quarter, all of them from the mid-range, none of them inside, operating in the 15 to 18-foot range, where Oakley's physicality could not follow him, and where his pull-up jumper was so mechanically reliable, so deeply wired into his muscle memory by years of pre-dawn solitary practice, that it functioned less like a basketball shot than like a fact being stated. Oakley covered him when the defensive assignment demanded it, and communicated through every such possession the same thing he communicated to every player he guarded, that this proximity had a cost, that he was here, and he was physical, and the space Jordan wanted was the space Oakley intended to occupy. He bumped Jordan on cuts. He held him briefly on screens. He crowded the catch with the practiced efficiency of a defender who understood that the most effective defense was the one that began before the ball arrived. The referees called some of it. They let more of it go. This was the Garden in 1993, and the Garden in 1993 had a specific understanding with the officials about what constituted basketball and what constituted the Knicks being the Knicks. Jordan played through all of it, and his face showed nothing. The Bulls were up by 2 at the end of the first quarter. Not a definitive lead, not a statement, just a margin that could go either direction, the kind of lead that gave a veteran team confidence it could manage the game, that the visitor had not yet broken through the thing the Garden was built to protect. Oakley stood at the free throw line at the quarter break, bouncing on his toes with the animated energy of a player who was competing at the precise level of intensity his body and career had prepared him for. And he looked across the court at Jordan, jogging to the visitors' huddle, and his expression contained the specific satisfaction of a man who believed his theory had survived the first quarter intact. Jordan had played well, but the framework that said physical, heavy, relentless Knicks basketball would eventually ask a price that a guard, even the best guard alive, would ultimately choose not to pay. That framework was still standing. It would not stand much longer. The second quarter brought a change in the Garden's atmospheric pressure that was perceptible before it was explainable. The Knicks were doing the same things they had done in the first quarter. The game looked, from a tactical standpoint, essentially continuous. But Jordan had finished his reconnaissance. He had spent 12 minutes measuring the coverage, identifying the specific patterns in Oakley's defensive positioning, mapping the 3 degrees of angle that separated Oakley's effective range from the corridor Jordan had decided he would use. The first quarter had not been competitive hesitation. It had been the intake breath before the sentence. He scored 14 points in 6 minutes of the second quarter, and not one of them came from the places the Knicks expected. He went left on Oakley twice, which was the direction the defensive scheme was designed to discourage, and both times he found the exact seam between Oakley's weight distribution and his recovery speed, the specific gap that exists in every defender's game, and that reveals itself only to players who have been patient enough and intelligent enough to wait for it to open. The Garden crowd, which had been hostile and expectant in the specific New York way that contains pride and skepticism in equal measure, began to produce a different kind of noise. Not the noise of a crowd watching a visitor succeed, the noise of a crowd watching something it had seen before and could not stop, a noise that contained in it the complex acknowledgement that this player was not going to be managed by the system in place. Oakley called a timeout. Not the coaching staff. Oakley. He walked to the sideline and told Riley, with the direct, undecorated communication of a veteran player who had earned the standing to speak plainly, that the defensive assignment needed adjustment. Riley looked at him with the flat, evaluating gaze of a coach who had managed enormous egos in Los Angeles, and understood that a player calling a timeout was a player who had felt something he didn't want to feel and was trying to renegotiate the terms. Riley adjusted the scheme. He brought help coverage closer to Jordan's catch points. He compressed the lane. Jordan looked at the adjusted coverage from the top of the key with the expression of a man reading a revised document and finding the revision insufficient. Remember what was happening in this building. The Knicks were the second best team in the Eastern Conference. Charles Oakley was one of the most physically punishing defenders in the NBA. Pat Riley had engineered defenses that had stopped Magic Johnson and Larry Bird and had brought the Los Angeles Lakers to 4 championships. This was not a soft defense facing a soft opponent. This was the best defensive organization in the conference trying, with everything it had, to contain a player who had already scored 23 points and was accelerating. The third quarter was when it ended. Not the game, the argument. Jordan came out of the locker room with the second half look. The specific closed expression his teammates had learned to identify across years of practice and competition. The expression that did not announce what was coming, but that guaranteed it. The look of a man who had received everything the first half had to offer and had decided, in the particular privacy of his halftime silence, that the second half would be conducted differently. He sat briefly in the locker room while Phil Jackson spoke, and his eyes were somewhere the room could not follow, deep in the plans he was already executing internally, the architectural drawings for what was about to be built on the floor above. Phil Jackson finished speaking. Jordan stood up first. The third quarter opened and the Knicks ran their defensive set with the disciplined, professional commitment of a team that believed in its structure and had the talent to execute it properly. Oakley was in position. The help was calibrated. The coverage was as tight as Pat Riley knew how to make it. For the first 2 minutes the scheme held. Jordan scored 4 points, and the Garden noise had in it a species of guarded optimism, the sense that perhaps the adjustments had worked, that perhaps the framework was sound. Then Jordan caught the ball on the right elbow, 12 feet from the basket, with Oakley in front of him and help arriving from the weak side. What happened next lasted approximately 3 seconds in real time and has been watched in the archival footage for approximately 3 decades since. Jordan pump-faked. Once. Oakley, 245 pounds of professional defensive experience, left his feet. Not entirely, not recklessly, just enough. The feet coming fractionally off the floor in the automatic response to a pump fake that the body generates before the mind can prevent it. The reaction of a player whose instincts had been calibrated over years against players for whom the pump fake was a negotiating tactic rather than a trap. Jordan did not jump. Jordan went around him. He was past Oakley before Oakley's feet had returned to the floor, moving through the lane with the specific controlled acceleration of a player who had manufactured this exact geometry, who had designed this situation over the preceding 27 minutes, and was now simply executing the final step of a plan the opponent had never been given access to. The help defender arrived too late. Jordan laid the ball up off the glass with his left hand, and it fell through the net with the indifferent inevitability of a thing that has already been decided. The Garden went quiet. Not the hostile quiet of a crowd trying to will a miss. A different quiet. The quiet of 20,000 people processing a visual argument that had just been completed without appeal. Oakley landed from his foul attempt with his hands slightly forward and his weight on his heels, and his eyes tracking the ball as it passed through the net. And in the exact moment of that tracking, something in his expression shifted that was not athletic disappointment. It was the more complicated experience of watching a theory you have invested in collapse at the exact joint where you believed it was strongest. He had been most confident about his ability to contain Jordan in the situations that required his physicality most directly. Jordan had just produced his signature play of the evening in the situation Oakley had been most certain about. He had given Jordan the fake. Jordan had taken the lane. And the thing about it, the thing that sat in Oakley's chest during the timeout that followed, was that he had done almost everything correctly. His positioning was right. His weight distribution had been appropriate. His response time was professional. He had simply been subject to a sequence that had been designed to defeat exactly the kind of correct positioning and appropriate weight distribution and professional response time that he was offering. Jordan had not beaten him by being physically superior. He had beaten him by being 3 moves ahead, which was a more complete defeat. because it was not a physical argument. It was an architectural one. Jordan stood at the free throw line and made both shots. The Knicks called timeout. The Garden crowd was making its noise again, but the quality had changed. The hostility now carrying in it the specific frequency of an arena that knows it is watching something it cannot stop. Riley stood at the whiteboard and drew lines, and Oakley listened with the tight, focused attention of a man in the middle of a major revision who is receiving new information and trying to incorporate it into a framework that was not built to accommodate it. Jordan sat on the Bulls bench with a towel over his shoulders and drank from a water bottle and looked at the Knicks huddle with the calm, unseeing patience of a man who was not watching the adjustments because the adjustments were not the story. He was waiting for the game to resume so he could continue the sentence he had been constructing all evening, the long, complex, rhetorically overwhelming sentence that had been building since tip-off and that was approaching its final clause. Oakley looked at him once across the distance of the floor, and Jordan did not look back. This was the most devastating thing Jordan ever did to an opponent. Not the scoring, not the pull-up jumper or the physical drive or the pump fake that removed a defender from the relevant geometry of the play. The most devastating thing was the refusal to acknowledge that there was a contest, the way he operated with such complete internal certainty that the external opinion of the opponent was simply not a variable he was tracking. Oakley had spent the first half being a credible defensive problem. Jordan had solved the problem and moved on, the way you move on from a problem that has been solved, without residual attention, without ceremony, already oriented toward whatever came next. Bulls by 9 entering the fourth quarter. Jordan with 31 points. He would finish with 42. The Bulls would win by 11. The number is in the box score and has been there since February 14, 1993, accessible to anyone who wants to look it up. What the box score does not record is the conversation, the one that was conducted entirely in the language of basketball over 48 minutes in the Garden, that had its origin in a casual remark about sleep and its conclusion in a pump fake that lasted a half second, and a layup that followed it, and the long, quiet car ride home that Oakley took through the February cold of Manhattan when it was over. He would say in the post-game press conference that Jordan was tremendous, that he had shown why he was the best player in the world, and he said it with the measured respect of a man who had received an education and was processing it with professional dignity. The reporters wrote down the quotes, the cameras captured his face. He held himself well, but in the specific quiet of his own interior, in the space between what a player says to reporters and what a player knows, Oakley was conducting a private accounting of the evening that would take longer than a press conference to complete. He had been right that physical basketball made Jordan pay a price. The price was real and documentable. What he had not understood, what the evening had demonstrated in terms so clear they could not be argued with, was that Jordan did not just absorb the price, he converted it. He took every physical cost the Knicks had imposed across 48 minutes and turned it into the fuel source for 42 points, for 6 assists that created baskets his teammates would remember as gifts, for a performance that was not despite the Jordan rules variant the Knicks had been running, but partially because of it, because the resistance was exactly what Jordan needed to organize his competitive energy around, the harder wall producing the harder push. Oakley understood this in a way that most players who competed against Jordan in that era took years to articulate clearly, if they ever did. He understood it because he had been Jordan's teammate in Chicago before the trade, had watched from the inside the process by which Jordan converted the obstacles of his environment into the material of his excellence, had seen in practice and on the road, and in the focused solitude of Jordan's pre-dawn gymnasium sessions, the outline of a methodology that was not talent in the ordinary sense, but something more like an ideology, a structured set of beliefs about what practice was for, what competition was for, what the specific pressures applied by opponents were actually providing. The pressure was not a problem. The pressure was the process. Jordan left Madison Square Garden that February night and did not look back at it. He was, by the time the team bus crossed the bridge, already in the next game in his mind, already identifying the next problem, the next opponent, the next evening that would require the same complete commitment. His former teammate, 2 miles behind him in a building still processing the evening, would carry that game into the weeks and months and years that followed, not as a wound exactly, but as a reference, as the clearest possible external demonstration of a principle he had watched being built from the inside, and had never fully appreciated until he stood on the other side of it. The score was the score. 105-94. 42 points for Jordan, 6 rebounds, 8 assists, the kind of complete game that announces not just that a player is great, but that greatness in his case is a comprehensive condition rather than a specific athletic gift. The Knicks would go on to 57 wins that season. They would meet the Bulls in the playoffs. They would compete with everything they had, with all the physicality and defensive intelligence and collective professional commitment that Pat Riley could organize. Jordan would score at least 35 points in every game of that series. The framework would not hold. It had never been designed to hold against a player for whom the framework's resistance was itself a resource. There is something that lives in that February evening beyond basketball, something that the game framed but did not contain. It is the principle that Jordan embodied so completely and so publicly that it became almost invisible through familiarity, the principle that the obstacles placed in front of you are not interruptions of your preparation, but the contents of it, that the person who imposes the hardest conditions is not your enemy but your collaborator in the construction of your own capability. Oakley gave Jordan 245 pounds of professional physical pressure for 48 minutes in the most hostile basketball environment in America. Jordan gave it back as 42 points, and a lesson that sat in the archived footage of that evening, like a letter that has been sealed and addressed and can be opened by anyone willing to look. He made the pump fake. He took the lane. He laid it in with his left hand. He landed, turned up the floor, and was already running before the ball finished its descent through the net. He did not look at Oakley. He never needed to look at Oakley. The scoreboard was doing all the looking that was required. The only weight that can never be lifted is the weight of what you refused to become when the resistance was highest.